Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter's with me today. I always invite him back, despite what he might say.
Happy snow day, Autumn. First snow season of the season. First snow days of the season. That's the way I should say it.
Yeah, first snowy days of the season, but it is not, in fact, a snow day in terms of the schools or business operations, and I was sort of wishing it were as I was trudging across town this morning.
The school by my house looked like one of those bumper car rides at the carnival. You know, just people going all sideways in every which direction as they were trying to drop their kids off. It was chaos.
It was kind of chaos, which is pretty typical for the first snowy days.
That's right.
Of the season. Yep. One of my attempted routes, there was a trash truck that had slid sideways into a pole. And so I started to turn that way and thought, oh, not going that way. But here we are. We made it. We're going to record today. And you suggested that we talk about this book on the podcast.
I did. I picked this book up after hearing the author on another podcast. Not as good of a podcast as the Vision for Life podcast, but there's many B-grade podcasts out in the world that still serve a reasonable purpose, and she was on one of those, and she just summarized the idea behind this book, and I thought, that is fantastic. I need to read that. So I got it and started reading it, and then I told you about it, and you got it, and you read ahead of me. You read more than I did, because that's kind of how you are. And I'm the tortoise, you're the hare when it comes to the reading.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I think this is a great topic of conversation because it's something we've talked about before, which is about the issue of masculinity and what is a man and what is a real man and what is a biblical manhood and these kinds of things. So sort all this out for us.
Yeah, we're going to try to in the space of a short conversation. We've had conversations on this topic before, though, on the topic of masculinity. And the book title that we're discussing today, we'll comment on more here in a moment, is called The Toxic War on Masculinity. Interesting title. It's by Nancy Pearcey. But when we had previously talked about masculinity, it's been quite some time ago now, there was an episode in which you and I discussed two articles. One was a GQ article about the new masculinity, and one was an article about Andrew Tate. We received a question from a listener after that episode, along with some very thoughtful commentary and input. And he essentially was saying, thank you for talking about this. He added some of his thoughts. And then he said, can I wear my salmon shirt?
That's
so
right.
For over a year now, we've been thinking about how to succinctly answer that question and what it implies.
And let's be honest, salmon is just a stand-in term for pink. Mm-hmm. It's a slightly more respectable, in some people's imagination, word for pink. So this man likes pink shirts, and he's not sure that you can be a real man and wear pink. And this book actually addresses the question of what is a real man, and is that even a valid question? So after reading this 352-page book, we are now equipped and
We're
prepared to answer that question, which we'll do at the end.
That's right.
Yeah.
At the end of today's conversation, we will answer that listener question. This maybe is the longest between ever receiving a question and responding directly to it on the podcast, but we worked our way back around to it. Yeah.
And when you introduced this book, you said, interesting title, The Toxic War on Masculinity. They say you should never judge a book by its cover or by the title, because oftentimes authors don't even get to choose their own titles, or it's been put through an editorial process where they have kind of settled on a title that their publisher will go with, but it's maybe not the title they would have used. And in both cases, I have not read this book because the title sounded kind of uninteresting and off-putting to me. And the cover is not very well done either. It's a very confusing cover.
It is.
But it's busy cover, and I like things neat and clean. Yeah. But I was aware of this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and I thought, oh, this is just gonna basically say, whereas toxic masculinity is a term that's kind of in the bloodstream of our culture, this is just gonna say the war on masculinity that's been birthed by the feminist movement is toxic, and that wasn't too appealing. I've heard people kind of make that argument for us. So it wasn't terribly appealing that I wanted to read 350 pages on it. and then when I heard the author describe the book and the big ideas, I was like, I think it's actually a lot better than the title. And I think I know Nancy Pearcey from some of her previous work, and I respect her previous work and have enjoyed it, especially in the historical analysis that she does. In that space, she sits in a very similar space to Carl Trueman, who we've read and discussed previously. She does history of ideas and how we got to cultural concepts that are prevalent today, but maybe weren't prevalent years ago, and what was the journey from here to there. She does good work on that. So when I heard her describe it, I thought, I have sold this book short because of its title, and I need to read this.
So we're saying don't judge the book by its title or its cover.
That's right.
Yeah, it's true. As often when we're reading a book for the Vision for Life podcast, I carry it around with me everywhere so that I can read in any spare moment I have. And over the course of the last couple of weeks, as I've toted this book around, I've received a few raised eyebrows and, oh, interesting.
Interesting.
We've come full circle, pendulum swung back the other way. Basically, the assumption is your assumption, Hunter, that this is just bashing feminism, which actually the book is not. It's not.
Yeah,
doing.
And I take covers off books that I don't want people to know what I'm reading for that reason.
You don't need the added.
I don't want someone on a plane next to me going, "What are you reading?" And then I have to try to explain this.
Good tactic. Good tactic. All right. Well, if Nancy Pearcey is not just bashing feminism or women or saying we are over feminized, then what is she doing? What is the big argument in this book?
At the introduction, she says there's a difference between what she's going to call a good man and what culture often calls a real man. And she notices that there's this tendency in our American culture today to call masculinity toxic, like as if there's a problem with manhood or masculinity itself. Masculinity is a bad thing that always leads to toxic results. It leads to chauvinism. It leads to the subjugation of women. It leads to exploitation. And so therefore we need to, control masculinity itself. And then that creates kind of a pushback that's like, no, we need to free men to be men. And so she opens up the book and she notices that when she writes this in the introduction, when the American Psychological Association issued its first ever guidelines for counseling men and boys in 2018, it denounced, quote, traditional masculine ideology as, quote, psychologically harmful. Groups like the APA have injected the phrase toxic masculinity into the bloodstream of America's public discourse. The phrase has become a catch-all explanation for male sexism, dominance, aggression, and violence. And she goes on to say, we all know that, masculinity can turn bad and men can use their strength for domination and aggression and violence. But this framing is leading to a blowback that's not good for our culture, and it's even just interjecting more tension into relations between men and women, and it's not putting forth a vision for manhood that would be good and redemptive. This is why the subtitle of her book is How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And so she's asking, is there a better way? And she says, yes, the better way is to differentiate between a good man and a, quote, real man.
I think that those two categories, the good man and the real man, which she uses throughout the book. So she introduces this concept in the introduction and uses these two categories to frame up the content for the entire book. I found those two categories and her explanation right at the beginning of the book so helpful, particularly because she explains where she got them from and why they're a very helpful differentiation between these two kind of visions of manhood.
Okay, this is a little long, but I want to read you how she kind of sets this up, because this sets the whole book up. We might say societies hold two competing scripts for what it means to be a man. Sociologist Michael Kimmel highlights the contrasts with an ingenious experiment. He started by asking cadets at West Point what it means to be a good man. If someone delivers a eulogy and says he was a good man, what does that mean? The cadets had no trouble answering. honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous, give to others. That's what it means to be a good man. Where did you learn that? Kimmel asked, and the cadets answered, it's everywhere. It's in our culture. It's the Judeo-Christian heritage. It's the air we breathe. Men seem to be innately aware of the software that God has coded into the male character. Now, she's saying something important right there. When we just ask a guy, what does it mean to be a good man? He, by the fact that he's just created in the image of God, that evokes something in him. And he typically just instinctively knows, well, that's things like taking responsibility and providing and protecting and giving myself for others. That's what it means to be a good man. Okay, she goes on to say, Kimmel then asked a follow-up question of these West Point cadets. What does it mean if I tell you, man the F up, be a real man? And the cadets shouted, oh, that's completely different. To be a real man means to be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. Kimmel has posed the same two questions to thousands of boys and young men in countries across the globe, from single-sex schools in Australia to a police academy in Sweden to former soccer stars at FIFA, and he virtually always gets the same answer. Men everywhere seem to experience tension between what they themselves define as the good man and the way the surrounding culture pressures them to be a real man. They sense the contradiction between the software and this, she's going to call the real man, a virus.
I thought that explanation that she used to set the stage, the description of this sociological experiment, basically, that turned into then some research that provided data that she's using throughout the book, was amazing because of the cross-cultural component of it. That the sociologist went to different places and asked young men and men in different cultures who had different experiences, how they would describe the good man versus whatever their culture's caricature is of the real man, and that it was consistent across culture. I found that very compelling and thought that these two categories then throughout the book were so helpful. I do have a question, though, because part of what she's addressing in this book, the subtitle is How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And there's this pervasive notion in Western culture that the version of masculinity that has been labeled as toxic, that now kind of includes really many of these masculine character traits that all get lumped in together, that version of masculinity is actually encouraged by Christianity, or even to some extent maybe came about because of Christianity being the prevailing religion in the United States or in the West for so long. So does Christianity lead to toxic masculinity is the question, and Pearcey is attempting to answer that as well.
She attempts to answer that. She devotes a whole chapter or a couple of chapters to that question. And she's going to notice that the real man, some of the stereotypes of the real man, are not necessarily bad. So she says, for example, like in a crisis, we need men who can stand up and stand tough and not collapse in tears. But it's meant to be a short-term strategy, not a way of life. And there's a problem that happens when this real man stereotype gets separated from the moral vision of Christianity and from what it means to be a good man. She says it can easily degenerate into sexism, dominance, entitlement, contempt for those who are perceived as weak, traits we can all agree are toxic. So she's going to say real Christianity does not contribute to toxic masculinity. It actually prevents toxic masculinity, and it takes the image of God that's woven into every man's heart to be a good man, and it gives birth to the good man. Now, she doesn't just suggest that theologically. She's done some work and consulted some studies to ask if that can be tested. And she basically says, studies have found this. Men who regularly attend church, they're family men who regularly attend church, they test out as the most loving husbands and as the most engaged fathers. Their wives are the most satisfied with their marriages. They have the lowest rate of divorce and the lowest rate of domestic violence of any group in America. So here's a quote. The evidence shows that Christianity has the power to overcome toxic behavior in men and reconcile the sexes, an unexpected finding that has stood up to rigorous empirical testing. We should be bold about bringing that into the public square.
Pearcey is careful to point out that different studies, she cites some, return different results. So she's careful to point out that data that doesn't differentiate between practicing, so you said a moment ago in that quote, men who attend church regularly or are practicing Christians. So data that doesn't differentiate between practicing and nominal evangelical Christians paints a very different picture.
That's right. She says men who would maybe on a survey, if they would check the box, I'm a Christian on a survey, but they rarely attend church, and they don't, which is kind of the marker that a lot of surveys will use for like, is your expressed faith actually making some real difference in your life? Does it actually affect how you organize your week and what you do with your time? She notices that men who would self-select, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but they rarely attend church, they're not involved in a church, they're not, quote, committed Christians, they don't exhibit any of the positive traits of the good man, or they don't exhibit them as much, I guess is the right way to say it. They don't exhibit the positive traits of a good man. In fact, statistically, they're more likely to get divorced. They're more likely to commit domestic violence. And she goes on to note those guys who are, let's use the term nominally Christian. Nominally means to take the name. They take the name or they profess Christianity, but they're not practicing Christians. The nominal, not practicing Christians statistically are actually worse than just the normal secular man.
I appreciated also that Pearcey is not taking the tone of just give guys a break. She's not just saying
right.
We've been too hard on men, and we just need to tone it down. Guys don't deserve this attack on their masculinity. She is going to great lengths to say there is this version of macho or machismo masculinity, and we might rightly be bothered by that. And she's saying that, you mentioned it earlier, is the real man script, and she's calling that the virus or the bug, and that a particular secular script leads men into thinking that that is the way to be a man. And so she's not excusing that sort of behavior or making any place for it.
In fact, she goes on to note that men who would be nominally Christian have often heard biblical terms like headship or that, like wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And then they take those terms and import meanings into them that the Bible did not intend. And they use those terms to justify traits that we would call toxic masculinity or what Christianity would just call sin.
So she's pointing out that the Bible presents a positive vision for the good man, and that when men are called up into that vision, that the real effect in homes and churches and communities and workplaces is collectively good. It's like for the common good. And so, as she puts it, men living out the values and virtues of the good man encourages this kind of effect in society. One of the big questions she's asking in the book is, how did this secular script arise? So how did masculinity become, quote, toxic?
Yeah, how did the good man and the real man get separated? That's actually the longest section of the book. It's what she does well. It's a long work of history. She's kind of tracing through history. It's the meat of the book. And you're going to summarize all that for us because you read that.
Because I read ahead in the book. I would like to point out to your earlier comment, it is not a tortoise and hare sort of reading situation. I'm just not reading the longest book ever written on the life of Winston Churchill. So I just dedicated more of my reading time.
I'm currently not only reading the longest book on the life of Winston Churchill, but I'm audiobooking the longest book on the life of LBJ. So I've got two long things going right now.
Well, I will take a crack at
Okay.
summarizing her argument. So she begins with examining the concept of manhood in the colonial era. And her biggest point in that section of the book is that during the colonial era, the moral vision for masculinity and families was integrated into the way that families existed in the various spheres in which they would have worked and lived. So men and women largely worked together in units at home, whether it was a business or a farm. And men were present with their households, with their wives and children to a greater extent in terms of overall time spent. The way they lived life was alongside each other, working together for common goals much more often. And heads of households had a particular role in communal life. So when men voted, for instance, the requirements at the time were that you had to be a property owner. And when men voted, they were voting for their household. So her argument in that section is that men had to be thoughtfully representative, not only of their individual interests, but of the interests of their wives and children and anyone else who they were responsible for who didn't have the ability to vote. And that's how much more of public life was structured. And so men, she says, of course, it didn't always happen, but that the prevailing notion was that the way that they participated in public life was for the common good, that it had a much more integrated vision of home and public life. And then the massive movement historically that began to reshape that reality was the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, those units, the households, were separated much more. Men often left to work, and women often stayed home to raise children. Men worked predominantly very long hours in factories or in various corporate settings, and women were largely left to raise children. And then in the industrial era, Pearcey argues, two scripts began to develop. There was a divide between public life and private life, and the values that started to predominate in public life were aligned more with a scientific or academic perspective on the nature of reality. And this is called in philosophy the fact-value
That's
split.
right.
So facts were contested then to be observable, sort of scientifically provable, objectively observable things. And values were relegated to the realm of sort of personal preference or personal ideas. And religion, and the values that you held to in your home, began to be relegated to this values category, which made them much more private, and they operated much less frequently in the public sphere. So men would leave their homes and have to operate on a different set of values when they went to work. And Pearcey argues that environment was often based on productivity and prosperity. So how do we get the most done?
Competition,
for the
too.
biggest benefit, and competition.
Yeah.
And men had to adapt to that kind of workplace. And so she said this created cognitive dissonance. And this is when that secular script for men really began to develop. And then she says that social Darwinism, which came about in the latter half of the 1800s, really as a theory, but then also began to bleed into the wider culture, contested that nature, the natural state of men, was to be one of competition and one in which the strongest prevailed. And so these traits that had begun to develop in the sort of workplace life of men then were reinforced as kind of the natural way that men are by this theory of Darwinism that became this socially acceptable theory. So that's how she traces this script kind of coming into existence and then beginning to bleed out into the broader culture.
And she's traced that before in her book, Total Truth, which is a fantastic read. And if our listeners haven't read that, it should probably be on their like good books to read at some point. she traces how this fact values split happened, particularly around the Industrial Revolution, the separation of home and work life, which then separated public and private life. And she makes the point that in that book that women got relegated in that arrangement, mostly to home and private world, and they were not considered part of the economically productive world that was happening out there that the men went off to work in. In this book, she's going to make the point that another result of that is the way men learned to operate out there became so disintegrated from the involvement in fathering their children and being a good husband that it allowed more room for the traits that were important out there in that world to get distorted and become entirely what it means to be a real man. To be a real man is to be a winner. It is to be competitive. It's to be cutthroat. It's to be ruthless out there. And then if that gets if those aren't to go out into the world and to do good work and to make a living, that's not a bad thing. But if you have to live in that kind of world and then you get cut off from the Christian moral vision, which also speaks to, it reintegrates our life. That's what the Christian moral vision does. It says all truth is God's truth. You live in God's world, and everything he's given you to do in creation is part of what he's given you to do as a man or as a woman. And for men, that includes being a husband. That includes being a father. For many men, that includes managing your household. And if that's not like part of your vision, then you're probably going to get distorted by what's out there in the world. And that's where this real man script starts to take over. As I hear that, I find that fascinating because when I've shared before on this podcast, when I first really started thinking about, quote, biblical manhood, I had a pastor teaching us through that. And he taught us that biblical manhood is about rejecting passivity and accepting responsibility. And he meant holistically for everything God's given you to do. And he would talk a lot about men accepting responsibility in their families and in their homes and not being passive as it pertains to what Pearcey would call private sphere kind of stuff, or home and marriage and that kind of life. And he would talk frequently about the temptation for men to devote all their energy to career and work and no energy to family, and how that distorts our masculinity. And so when he would say lead courageously, he didn't mean just like go out there and win things in the world. He also meant leading courageously in your home and in your relationships. And so anyway, I think she is also showing us that Christianity reintegrates life. It puts God back over everything, and that should have an effect on how we envision what it means to be male and what it means to be female, and in the case of this book, what it means to be, quote, a good man.
To what you just said, the accepting responsibility, I like that you talk about how your mentor emphasized accepting responsibility for the realm of the home, the area that is sometimes relegated to being, or had been for a while, post-industrial revolution, relegated to being women's work, in which women were seen as the protectors of those values, the personal or more religious or sacred order values that had been divorced from the public sphere of work. I think Pearcey would even say that if she were to use that kind of language, based on her argument in the book, that it's accepting responsibility not only for this kind of integrated vision of life, but one also that recaptures this ability to think about the common good, how your life is for others, and how your participation in society can actually bring about good for others.
That's right. And then at the end of the book, there's like one last move she makes, which is, I mean, already the argument she's made is very compelling, but then she makes this one last move in her argument, and it's kind of like the double drop kick at the end of the wrestling match. It's, to use a real man kind of image
Metaphor.
here. This is Hulk Hogan with the double leg drop, on Ric Flair. That's what this last move is. I'm just like, man, she just brought the thunder there. And she kind of makes this point. she goes, what? She asked the question, what happens when nominally Christian men, meaning they would say, I'm a Christian, I believe in Christianity, but they're not really active in their faith. What happens when nominally Christian men absorb the more secular script for masculinity? And she says this, they do not show the same results as church-going Christian men who she kind of celebrated at the beginning of the book. They tend to spiritualize the secular script, and it becomes worse as a result. They kind of put a Christian veneer on the real man script, and they become worse as a result. So here's what she says. Most of these men are nominal Christians, which means they're not particularly devout and attend church rarely, if at all. They are prone to pick up terms like headship and submission, but interpret them through a secular lens of power and control. Surprisingly, research has found that nominal Christian men have the highest rates of divorce and domestic violence, even higher than secular men. That's the double leg drop.
Yeah, she's returning to this differentiation between practicing someone who would call themselves a Christian who is committed and practicing Christianity. And she, towards the beginning of the book, explains how Christianity does call men into a vision of being a man that, as we mentioned earlier, brings about a good effect in their homes, in communities, in neighborhoods, in churches. And so she returns to this differentiation between someone who is following the good man script and someone who is following the real man script, but as you said, applying a veneer of Christian terminology over it. I have one more question, though, in that regard. I think I'm not very well versed in this, so I'm going to say something. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think there was maybe 20 years ago, I'm trying to base this based on my own age, a slew of some Christian books that were written by Christian authors that kind of took this notion that men's nature is something more along the lines that social Darwinism would have contested, that men are naturally strong and wild or warriors and tried to kind of combine that ethos of being a man with some Christian principles. Our writer, or our friend who sent in a question, our listener who sent in this question about the salmon shirt, even mentioned that in his response to our prior conversation about masculinity. He was basically saying there is a Christianized kind of version of this real man script. So how does that factor into this conversation and our understanding of, as Pearcey says, how Christianity reconciles the sexes?
I think we have to acknowledge there are differences between men and women that we can just kind of observe. And Pearcey talks about this in her book, is men tend to be physically stronger and they're physically bigger usually than women, and they're stronger. And so there is a strength, a physical strength that men have that is usually beyond what women have, and that does affect the kinds of things God calls them to do, especially in that protector, provider kind of space. And I think that is why when you ask men, what does it mean to be a good man, like being a protector or being the one that goes off to war if he has to, is part of what it means to be a good man. So I do think it's important that we acknowledge that God-given potential. And I would guess that in the pushback against, quote, toxic masculinity, there might also be a shadow, because that most people who are doing that are sinners too. There might be a shadow that wants to, in some ways, even strip off what is essential to masculinity because they've seen it distorted. And so this is where I find the Christian perspective to have such the right balance, and the one that she's advocating for in this book, to have such the right balance. She's saying it is perfectly okay for men to be strong. It's perfectly okay and good that men would have a sense that sometimes you've got to go and protect and fight, but it needs to be done out of noble motives, not out of shadowy sinful motives. And that's what the gospel does. The saying is grace redeems nature, or grace restores nature. It takes what is natural and given us by God and has been distorted by sin, and it doesn't eliminate what is natural, but it redeems it and restores it to its purpose. So I would have to, evaluate those books on a case-by-case basis. I can remember some of those books, and some of them were much better theologically than others. Some of those books were rooted more in kind of pop psychology, and those aren't that good. And then some of them were going back to, Genesis in particular, and crafting a theology of manhood based on what God gave to Adam before the fall. And I thought those books were better. So you got to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis.
Don't judge a book by its title or cover or your unlearned interpretation of its content without reading it.
That's right. And we have to ask, how does Christ redeem masculinity? And I think one of the emphases that you'll get when you put that lens on is sacrificial. Jesus sacrifices himself. That's what it means to be head of the church. He gives himself up for the church. So then Paul takes that and applies it to husbands. You're to sacrifice yourself for the sake of your wife's well-being. So it takes our ideas, our kind of God-given imprint that I'm to be a good, noble man, and it says, and what that's going to look like is not dominance and control. It's going to look primarily like sacrifice. It's going to look like going first into the hardest things, And so I think if we're putting that lens on it, putting the lens of what did Christ do on there, I think we tend to keep the redeemed from just the secular, kind of distinct.
All right. Well, we said we would answer our listeners' questions, so I think we're at the point in the episode where we can do that.
Yes, we can do that. And as I was reflecting on this, like, what does this mean for me pastorally? I thought, this book really underscores the importance of differentiating between the God-given created masculinity, which is like good man, versus cultural stereotypes, be a real man, and be sure that we're not teaching cultural real man stereotypes as somehow essential to being a good Christian man. And part of the reason that it's important to keep those separate is men have different personalities, they have different temperaments, they have different giftings. Some men are stronger, or even though men are strong, generally speaking, some are stronger than others. And so if we put these real man stereotypes and we say, this is what it means to be a man, there are inevitably going to be tons of men who are alienated from those stereotypes. And so this is, I think, a great test case. Can a man wear a pink shirt? And if you put the real man lens on, there would be some who would say, well, that's actually a debate. Real man cannot wear pink, or real man can wear pink. It's kind of a funny, debate. But if you ask, can a good man wear a pink shirt? You're asking, can a man who is giving himself to a noble cause, can a man, if he's a husband who is sacrificially loving his wife, if he's a father, that man is devoted to the training and the discipleship of his children, and he's providing for his home. Can that man wear a pink shirt? Absolutely. That man should put on a pink Oxford shirt at Easter and take his family to church. and some of the best men I know are proud of how they dress and look, when they go out in public, and it's just part of actually their nobility, not because they are using clothes to kind of puff themselves up, but it's just part of the essence of who they are. But it's always attached to, this is a good man in the ways that you would want. So absolutely, get that pink Oxford shirt and wear it.
Yes, we would say good men can wear pink shirts.
I'm glad you agree.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I think the second reflection we would offer at the end of this conversation is that it is important to teach, to provide a good vision for what virtuous masculinity, what the good man looks like. And to call men into that. And then to what you mentioned earlier about this differentiation and the way that sometimes this dynamic occurs, that nominal Christian men might hear certain categories within Christianity and attach secular meanings to it, that we need to explicitly teach that. We have an opportunity to call men who might hear certain categories and attach secular meanings, to give them a better vision and to show them what the good man script looks like, and to let them know that that is a noble calling.
Yeah, I saw mission opportunity all over this when I was reading it, because there's something in men that wants to know, how do I be a good man? And she's telling us that nominal Christian men are prone to corrupting their masculinity into something that becomes toxic. They're even more prone than secular men. And I thought, but nominal Christian men are also culturally and relationally closer to the church than the average secular guy is. In other words, they may officially be a member of a church, or they might, attend church at some point, or they would think of themselves as, I probably should attend church. That might be a nominal Christian man. So they're actually closer to where I sit as a pastor culturally than someone who's completely living this a secular life and giving no regard to the church. And that's a huge missional opportunity, to speak to nominal Christian men and say, God has called you to something good and noble. And let's talk about what it means to be a good man as God made you to be. I saw this play out when I was in my 20s as a young man. My church did this teaching on what it means to be a good man. They called it the quest for authentic manhood, and they taught this theology of manhood, and it spoke to me. But I noticed that I had some guys that I was friends with who would fall into this nominal Christian men. They would surely say they were Christian. I lived through 4 years of college with them, and I would say they were definitely not practicing Christians, right? And some of them not only came to this teaching the church was doing on what it means to be a good man, but some of them became Christians through that. They actually converted to gospel Christianity through that, because God met them in their desire to be a good man. In fact, one of them, I see him fairly regularly when I'm back in Arkansas, and when I saw him a couple of years ago, he laughed because he's an elder in the church there now, and he would not have been an elder candidate when we were in college, and he laughed, and he said, "I bet when we were in college, you didn't think you were going to be a pastor, and you sure as hell didn't think I was going to be an elder." And I was like, I sure did not.
Well, Hunter, thanks for suggesting this book, for talking about it with me today. For those of you listening, send us your questions. So if you have thoughts, follow-up thoughts about today's episode, or questions based on this topic, then we want to hear from you. So send all those things along with suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss in the future to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.